Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Rather than introduce myself and the other two presenters, my friend Alyssa, who is one of us three co-presenters, is going to be doing that. So Alyssa, you can go ahead and share your screen and
Fantastic.
there you go.
All right, can you see my screen,
Yes,
Kevin? All
it
right,
works good.
great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session this afternoon. We titled this Reach All Students, How Can We Make Our Educational Content Accessible to All? And this was actually conceptualized 2 years ago. I've known Laura for a long time, but once I met Kevin 2 years ago in Philadelphia at the last TAA conference that we all attended in person. And this was a great idea that we came up with. And for 2 years, we've kind of postponed it until we can finally present on it with you all today. And so we're very excited to talk on this topic today. So Kevin started to introduce himself, but if you know Kevin or if you don't know Kevin, he's anatomy and physiology professor, but also textbook author. Alyssa, am a communication studies professor. And Laura Jacoby is a communication studies associate professor. And the purpose of our panel today is twofold. First, we're going to talk about accessibility concerns in textbooks, but we'll also talk about implementation of our experiences with textbooks and such materials in the online and traditional classrooms. And then we're also hoping to have enough time at the end of our session to engage in a lively discussion with all of you and to answer any of the questions that you have. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin, who will kick off the first half of our presentation.
Okay, thanks, Alyssa. The t- the subtitle, really, the title of my little section is Inclusion and Accessibility in Textbooks. And that word inclusion implies that we don't want to leave anyone out. That is, we want to include everyone. And that means all users must have full access to the content. And full access implies that there won't be any content that is accessible to some, but not all users. And this is not solely about obvious challenges, such as my hearing impairment, or my mom's vision impairment, or my friend's motor impairment. It's about any kind of challenge. Next. So, how do we assure access in textbooks? Now, I've been authoring textbooks for over 3 decades, and we're still not there. Hand me any textbook and I'll show you at least 3 ways it's not universally accessible. Nobody is there yet. It's a daunting task, but it's a worthwhile task. You know, the work may never end, but it's still important to do the work and get as far as we can, as quickly as we can, so that everyone is included. Next. So the question is, what is the author's role? Do authors even have a role? Isn't that, the publisher's responsibility? Next. Well, I think that we authors do have some important roles in making our textbooks accessible. First of all, we can help identify opportunities for our publishing team to make improvements. We can always implement changes that are within our sphere of responsibility. Besides identifying opportunities, we might be able to suggest specific implementation strategies to our publisher. I think an important role for authors is to advocate for accessibility. And authors really do have a lot more sway and power with our editors and publishers than I think we give ourselves credit for. So, I think there's something to be said for that proverbial squeaky wheel. And lastly, if we're willing to step up and be an active and willing partner, I think we'll see a lot more happening on the accessibility front with our publisher. Next. Now, many of you may already be familiar with Universal Design for Learning, also known as UDL. UDL is a starting point for my own author team. Universal design is a widely used framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people, based on scientific insights into how humans learn. And of course, one key element is that UDL benefits all people. I circled it so you can see that emphasis there, all people. Next. Now here's a summary of guidelines for UDL. I'd like you to all memorize the, no. It's too much. Now this is, you can find this at, you can see the URL along the side. It's at cast.org, cast.org. And they have this handy graphic organizer to get us started using universal design. And we don't have time to go through the whole thing now, and you can't really read it very easily anyway. So please don't try to read it. You'll lose track of what we're talking about here. Next. The middle column, which suggests that we provide multiple means of representation, is an easy place to start when thinking about textbooks. In that middle column, it suggests that we provide options for perception, provide options for language and symbols, and provide options for comprehension. The key point here, of course, is provide options. Generally speaking, the more options for assessing content we make available, the more accessible our content is. Next. So starting with that first point, that is to provide options for perception, we can think about auditory perception and visual perception experienced by our textbook users. Now that sounds straightforward, but there's a huge spectrum of variations of ability to access content in the auditory and visual domains. In these images that you see here, I'm highlighting the difference between typical color vision on the left and a very common variation of color vision on the right. Now, some of you that have that kind of variation of color vision might not even see a difference or much of a difference between those two images. Now, think about what this can mean for color-coded graphs, color highlighting of content or figure callouts, or the colors we use for headings. Now, there's some ways to deal with this, though. Choosing colors while also keeping variations of color vision in mind is a good strategy. The URL that you see in this slide is one of several places that you can go to test your images or text for various kinds of color vision. And coupling color coding with other strategies such as patterns or using contrast or varying saturation of color, those can also be good approaches. The point is, there are often workable solutions. Next. So then we get to the point of providing options for language and symbols. In specialized terminology, we want to frequently offer options and definitions of all of them, not just define them once and then keep using them, maybe go back a couple of times, especially if they show up in different sections of the book. We also want to clarify syntax and structure. And we need to consider the decoding of symbols and abbreviations, including jargon and acronyms that we often throw around as if everybody's already comfortable with them. That all they need is that one definition, and now the reader has complete mastery of that abbreviation or that symbol. Another example at the bottom of the slide is a set of two common ways to symbolize the calcium ion in chemistry. This calcium ion is a particle with a double positive charge, which you might be able to figure out even if you're not a chemist by looking at that symbol. Now, for me, without even having to stop to think about it, I realized that both of these symbols represent the same thing. But this isn't true for naive science students, at least not all of them. Some of them might be able to figure out, but some of them won't be able to figure it out. And they often get confused when they encounter a different way of expressing concepts. So maybe I better connect that for them. So we need to think about whether we're being clear enough with our abbreviations and considering options that might be more clear. Another point is understanding across languages. Many of our users are most fluent in a dialect or language other than the one that we as the author are using. And of course, using multiple media is a good way to offer options of representing concepts. Next. the Lost my notes here. Oh, here they are. All right. So the next point is to provide options for comprehension. Now, this worksheet that you see pictured here is a first grade assignment completed by a neurotypical, rather bright first grader. He's a son of a friend of mine. Now, looking at that direction in the worksheet that says, explain your thinking, maybe that's not a very direct or very clear message about what's expected of the student. Many thinkers don't consciously know the steps they use to arrive at an answer. They just know the answer by making subconscious connections. Providing an additional or alternate instruction here may have earned this smart little guy full credit. I think that probably would have happened. I have to constantly relearn the fact that not everyone thinks like I do. I can't assume anything as an author. I don't know my textbook users' background knowledge, how they think, or what experience they've had with models and graphs and making connections. Next. My last and most important point is that I found that in both my textbook work and in my teaching, the more I design for accessibility, the more all students benefit. If I give options for visual, auditory, language, and comprehension, then those with challenges in these areas benefit. But you know what? So does everyone else. That means that the more we work on accessibility, the more it will benefit every single learner. Well, over and out from me. So, Alyssa, are you up next?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, Kevin. And a lot of what Kevin's already talked about will be echoed in what I'm going to present on. And I want to introduce and probably not spend a lot of our time looking at open educational resources. Kevin touched very much on the use of traditional textbooks, and the past 2 years, I've started implementing open education resources, OER for short. And so I wanted to incorporate that in our conversation today and talk about accessibility within OER just very quickly. So I want to define OER before we move on. I found this definition last week, and I think it does a great job conceptualizing OER. So OER is described as any educational resource, curriculum maps, course materials, textbooks, streaming videos, so on and so forth, that are openly available for use by educators and students without an accompanying need to pay royalties or license fees. I've used OER very heavily the past couple of years, like I've said. I have not authored an OER, although I have reviewed multiple OERs for the sake of accessibility, and I've also implemented them into a variety of courses that I teach in communication studies. And one of the things that OER really prides itself on is being accessible through the cost of saving money in offering textbooks more specifically. And when we look at this through an accessibility lens, we also see that OER can benefit students experiencing disability, because students with disability often are experiencing rates of poverty double the rate we would see with a general population. So I wanted to incorporate this into our conversation today, because with accessibility in OER, we can make it accessible from the start using what Kevin talked about with Universal Design for Learning, UDL for short. What we know with OER is that it can be edited, it can be changed. I'm going to show you a couple resources that have been very helpful in not only using an accessible lens when looking at OER materials, but also how we can display that to those using our textbooks. I actually found a lot of what I'm about to show you from this link here, which I'm more than happy to share in the chat function. And it's called Accessibility Toolkit, and it's a second edition. It's actually a textbook, and it's brilliant in terms of creating an accessibility checklist, but also an accessibility statement, which I'll describe very quickly at the end of my little subsection today. The first thing I want to talk about is their accessibility checklist. And I think think this can be used for both OER, but also educational materials in general. The list is actually much longer than what I'm going to present to you here today, but there are some things that I noticed from what they put forth in an accessibility checklist as to my own use in reviewing OERs that oftentimes I see authors breeze over or they forget. The first is organizing content, and this seems very straightforward, but I recently reviewed a textbook that often had just paragraphs and paragraphs of information without any sort of headings or subheadings to guide students in how they should be reading the material. And it often became hard for my students, if they were looking through materials like this, to find where they should be or what information they should be gearing their attention towards. So it was really hard for them to navigate the content from just an organizational standpoint. This OER that I also reviewed, midway through a sentence would throw in a citation, and essentially their citations were just links or hyperlinks to the source that they used. And that's a big no-no, because we know that with links, oftentimes they're changing. So if we click on that link a year from now, that may not work. And so when I was reviewing that, it was just a big red light to me that for students, that was not going to be accessible. And if we looked at this accessibility checklist, it even says under links not to put a link in there for purposes that I've already stated. In terms of images, it's very important that you provide alternative text to describe the image that the student is looking at. If you are putting an image in there for decorative purposes, you wouldn't have to provide an alternate tag, but you also don't want to make sure that those images are in line. And oftentimes I see that with reviewing open education resources, is sometimes with formatting, the images may be put off, and it can confuse students as to what they're looking at, or once again, the organizational flow of the material that they're reviewing. We can also apply this to things like tables, font sizes, and multimedia usage. And although most of this is fairly straightforward from a universal design standpoint, or what we know as accessible content creators, one thing that was difficult for students when using OER was font size. And font size seems like something that would be straightforward for an author, but a lot of students had struggled with the way that they could access their OER, and how the text or font size that they were reviewing was not accessible to them. I recently had a student who was struggling with learning how to zoom in on the OER that I had provided students to use. That was just a quick learning moment that I had with her to teach her how to zoom in on her document, but it did raise a question in my mind to say, well, do we have the ability to zoom in on this document in a way that is accessible for her to read? And fortunately, that was the case, but we have to keep in mind that students may need to zoom in, and some of the font sizes or style fonts that they choose are not accessible. There is a platform called OpenStax, and if you've used OER, you're probably familiar with OpenStax, but they are one of the platforms that uses OERs that adhere to this checklist that I provided. So you know that if you are reviewing an OER to use or implement within your classroom, that it adheres to an accessibility checklist that upholds all of these that I've talked about and more. Another thing that I really liked from this toolkit that I was looking at was an idea of an accessibility page. And I might actually change my screen and show you what this looks like in practice. Actually, I didn't. Here we go. So got to change this around. So I wanted to show you what this accessibility statement looks like. And this was at the start of the accessibility toolkit, where I also referenced the accessibility checklist. And what's very interesting about this is that it comes first and foremost before they get into talking about the toolkit acknowledgements or introductions. So the first thing they introduce is this accessibility statement. And as you scroll through it, the first thing is that it talks about how the authors designed this resource to adhere to accessibility standards, so almost using that UDL lens. So they briefly describe how they've used a UDL lens to create this resource. They then talk about other file formats that would be available for students to use or users to use when accessing this. But what I thought was very interesting is that they include this known accessibility issues and areas for improvement. So at this point in time, they have not made any changes to their open education resource for accessibility issues that have been brought to their concern. However, if someone were to reach out to the author of this piece, they would be able to update this chart where they would list the location in which the accessibility issue arose, how they improved it, the timeline, and the workaround. And I think that this is a very important communication tool to show that they are putting accessibility concerns at the forefront of what they're designing, but also listing where they found that and been able to make improvements. And then they also further with talking about accessibility standards, and they list their contact information. Once again, if someone were to find something that is an accessibility concern, they can reach out to the authors of this piece, and they're going to hopefully come back to this accessibility issues chart and be able to find ways to improve the resource that they've created. So I thought that this was a really unique accessibility chart that they provide at the start of their book, and how they have put accessibility at the forefront of what they're creating. Okay, so I am going to switch over to Laura. So I'm going to go back to the slide, and Laura, you are up next.
All right. So along with textbooks and OER, beyond that in the classroom, we also need to meet accessibility needs in the content that we share and the way we structure content. And in this last year, especially with COVID, with everything having to move online, it was important to be able to do that online. I come at this from a slightly different perspective. You heard Kevin mention that meeting accessibility needs benefits everyone. I come at it from the perspective of doing things using a lot of variety, benefiting everyone will help those with accessibility needs. And I come at it from that perspective largely because this is not my area of expertise. It's not something I've researched, accessibility. However, I had a student in an online class once who had accessibility needs. She had a number of different cognitive impairments, and she also worked for accessibility resources on campus. And she asked me once to present with her on universal design for learning for a department on campus to help them to structure their online classes in such a way that helped to meet accessibility needs. And I didn't even realize that I was doing that. Part of my research agenda is online learning. So I've spent some time researching what makes effective online learning, and just found out that the way I was structuring my classes were helping to meet accessibility needs. Next slide. And so I'm using this student's experience. I'm actually going to share some things that she shared with me, some screenshots of things from my class versus others that give a visual of what worked for her, and then some of my own research on online learning. Next slide. So this is shared from this student. This is a visual of a different online class that she took and how she found the structure ineffective. On the left, you can see modules that seem clear, syllabus, readings, assignments, but then when you open them up, it's not very well organized for her. It was difficult for her to navigate this site. Next slide. And so this was from the class she took from me, and she found this organization pattern much easier to follow. So I just have syllabus and major assignments, and then each week the different lessons, and then within each lesson, there's that same structure: an overview, study notes, the PowerPoint presentation, and PowerPoint slides. Next slide. So in the studies that I'd done on online learning, one of them, I asked students, it was a case study, I asked them about what they found most effective about the online discussions and the recorded lectures. So the structure in this particular case study of the discussions was that they were 33, they were a third of the grade, so they were a significant part of the grade. Students had to pass one of two quizzes to post to the discussion board, and they needed to respond to discussion prompts and to one another's posts. So that's just kind of an overview of what it looked like. Next slide. And this is what they saw each week. So the instructions of how to post their entry, the discussion questions, and then what was the expectations in terms of responding to other students. Next slide. And so these are things they found ineffective and effective. What they found ineffective, having to pass a quiz first to post to the discussion board. Whether that was because they didn't want to take the quiz, I don't know. That could have been the case. But some of them didn't like having to pass the quiz first. The reason that I had them pass the quiz first was because I wanted them to at least have basic foundation of the content so that their discussion posts were more informed posts. They were open quizzes, 5 points, not very difficult. And unmotivated group members. So some of them had group members, they were put in small groups for discussions, and some of them found that frustrating when other group members were unmotivated and either didn't post or posted not very effective posts. Next slide. And the things they found effective, they liked working in small groups. They liked being able to see the posts of their classmates. They liked having enough time in which to process and post responses. So I always have due dates were always Thursdays, every week Thursday. So they had them once a week. And I would think in terms of accessibility, that gives that time to process as well. And they liked the discussion questions that they were application of real life experiences. Next. The recorded lectures, this is how they were structured. There were PowerPoint presentations with an audio voiceover. When I used to teach at the University of Minnesota, the closed captioning wasn't an option, so I provided transcripts and always the slides as well. And I had them professionally recorded. I just like to do things more professionally, and I think it makes it more clear and good audio and all of that. Next. So this is what they looked like there. Next slide. What they found ineffective. Some of them didn't like the lack of connection to the textbook material. That's just partly my philosophy, is that I feel like students can read the textbook, and I would like to highlight important things from there, but I also want to add. I feel like my job is to add things beyond the textbook. So some students didn't like that. They wanted it more based on the textbook. Next. And the things they did like that I think meet accessibility needs more, as you'll see from the student's experience in a second. I called it the trifecta approach, where I had the lecture available in 3 different forms. So it was audio, PowerPoint slides, and transcript, which helps to meet a variety of accessibility needs. They liked that the audio felt like a live class. I guess it sounded natural to them. They liked that they were concise. Typically they're 15 to 20 minute lectures, and they liked that they were informative and highlighted key points. Next. So this is what they look like currently. I have a voiceover with an image of me introducing the lecture, and then it moves to PowerPoint slides. Easy play button there, and this one's 21 minutes. So again, they're around 15 to 20 minutes. Next. And now I'm able to do closed caption at Minnesota State University, which I know I've heard from a number of students that they find that helpful. Next. And this is from that student who had accessibility needs and worked for accessibility resources. She shared with me this is a PowerPoint slide from a different class that she took that she found frustrating as a person with cognitive impairment. It has a busy pattern, it has long sentences, there are no bulleted lists, and the points and subpoints within it are unclear. It's like Alyssa was talking about earlier, the content being kind of lumped together makes it difficult to follow. Next. This is an example she shared with me of a slide from the class she took from me. So she liked that it was plain slides, embolded fonts, bulleted list, and indented subpoints. Next. So in summary, I think the clear structure and clear information, just in the same way that Alyssa was referring to with OER resources, also including that teaching presence, that immediacy to connect with students in an online class, especially, so that they still get that feel of who you are and connect with you. Consistency, so similar, like I mentioned, 15 to 20 minute lectures, That consistency, I think, helps those with accessibility needs. Consistent due dates helps everyone, consistent requirements. And then, like Kevin was talking about, having lots of options that adapts not only to those with accessibility needs, but to everyone.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Laura. We are going to switch to more of our discussion that we wanted to see out of our session. And I'll kind of tell you what we're going to do. But Kevin, as I'm doing that, would you be able to put our participants into breakout rooms?
Yeah, I have 8 breakout rooms set up.
Perfect. Thank
So,
you.
yeah.
So we're going to give you all 5 minutes to meet with other participants in this session to kind of take in all of the information we presented in front of you and discuss what you found as new findings from our session today, or to also discuss maybe existing insights that you could add to this conversation. So perhaps something we may not have touched on or talked about in our session, but we'd love to hear from you to deepen our understanding of accessibility in textbooks. So we're going to turn it over to you for about 5 minutes to have just a quick discussion, and then we'll bring it back to the large group where we will share out, we'll further our discussion, and then we'll answer any questions that you have. So I had a lively discussion with my group. I met with Margaret and Brenda, so that was great meeting with you all, but I would love to hear from the other breakout rooms that I didn't have the pleasure to attend. So I was curious, for just the next couple minutes before we answer questions, if there were any new insights or aha moments you wanted to share with the group.
In the group I was in, I started out the discussion talking about color vision issues and getting feedback directly from student volunteers, or just friend volunteers who do have red-green color blindness. I sent them some of my art and I asked them about their perceptions of the art and whether their particular way of seeing colors compromised their ability to extract my intended meaning from the art. I won't elaborate on that because that'd be another breakout topic, but I think that direct student feedback is invaluable. We got some really interesting insights from that.
Well, we just ended up introducing ourselves. We didn't get very far in my group, but I did have a question that I wanted to ask about. It struck me that Laura, that your student was really distracted and couldn't read the paragraph. And I thought to myself, well, isn't that what we do in textbook writing? We write paragraphs, right? So, I was wondering if we, we're going to do something more in a digital format, if our publishers would be interested in doing it in more bulleted lists and making it a little clearer for the student, because, textbooks are paragraphs as they're currently written.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I didn't know if it was about context and expectations in a lecture format, that was why the bullet pointed helped. She was a brilliant student and, 4.0 student. So I'm sure she would have done whatever was necessary. But I do think with the reading material, it takes her probably twice the amount of time as anyone else to navigate. So that is a good point. And maybe textbooks should accommodate in that way as well.
Yeah.
I've actually had a few students that have had that kind of issue. And in our textbooks, and this wasn't my idea, this was an idea of a past co-author, so I'm not claiming any credit for it, but it has worked out that at the end of every chapter, we have, and a lot of textbooks do it, so it's not like some unique thing in our book, but we have an outline of the entire chapter. So it's it's not bulleted, it's a traditional, ABC, Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, but it's still not a paragraph. And I've had a number of students who said that they have a really hard time reading the text, so they go straight to that summary in the back, and that really helps them. And a few of them said that after reading through that and a couple of times and, doing some other studying, and that when they go back to read the chapter, it makes a lot, they can do it. They can not necessarily do it the way you and I would read a text, but they can muddle their way through it. Now, when they got a cold, they couldn't. And so it's anecdotal, but that might, so, I mean, that's an example of options. You have the text, the narrative text, and you have the outline.
I have a book that's publishing in September, and it's a second edition. And one of the things that in working with the publisher, they really broke the content down into more subheadings. So it's small chunks for the students. And visually, it's so much more engaging, and they can find the information so much easier. And it's more digestible because of those additional subheads. Because when I look at the original versus the new, it's really, a lot of it is the same information. There's a lot of new information, but it's so much more digestible.
I noticed at my college, there was a big effort because it was required for something college-wide to make resources, web pages, online courses accessible. And there were a couple of workshops and trainings that not everybody attended, and that was it. And then, there aren't very many resources available at all. And I was interested in someone else's chat comment that Kevin replied to about how a college was ignoring or choosing not to make their web page accessible. So I was wondering what might be helpful in addressing that kind of issues.
Well, I don't want to be the one answering every question, but I do have an insight, and that is just wait until somebody sues the school. And I've seen that happen. I've had a couple of colleagues in A&P, for example, at different schools who suddenly became experts in accessibility because, a student successfully sued, but it doesn't even take that. I had a big wake-up call a number of years ago when I had someone with a profound hearing loss who needed an interpreter, and I had just set up several dozen videos, like pre-lecture videos for my students that were not captioned and there was no transcript. So I had to immediately go back and do all that transcripting. And this was at a time when transcripting wasn't as easily available as it is now. So now, I learned my lesson. So now I work really hard to make things as accessible as possible as soon as I create them. And I still, it's not complete. I mean, it's just a big, huge task to do. But if I do a little bit here and a little bit there, then when I face another student who has these issues, then most of the work is done and I don't have that much more. But using these universal design for learning, using their principles, it really guides me into what kinds of things I can do to make that happen. So. Okay, we're at time, so we're going to have to close this out. Golly, we just got started, it seems like. So I appreciate my friends Alyssa and Laura. Thank you so much for coming together and bringing me into your group, and thank everyone else for being here and participating in our breakout and our discussion and so on.